this is ripe. Oh, this is ripe. Oh, this is ripe. It appears the time is ripe for another trek to Nederland. I'm Veronica Lewis, and today on Let's Go Dutch, we're going to de Rijp.
I'm gonna travel the world. I'm gonna go where the Dutch have been, and I'm gonna share it with you, my friends. Let's go Dutch. Let's go Dutch. Let's go Dutch.
We'll explore an obscure village that used to be an island before the surrounding lakes were drained. We'll then enjoy some tranquility in the peaceful village of Broek in Waterland. So put on your clogs and let's go Dutch. Located just 50 minutes by bus from Amsterdam in the Noord Holland province, de Rijp is a step back in time without being overrun by tourists. Before we go on, a word of the day is in order. Our woord vandaag is polder. A polder is dried out land that the Dutch reclaimed from the sea and lakes. They did this using windmills. That's one reason why you see windmills all over Nederland. De Rijp is a village surrounded by polders. Before 1607, it was an island surrounded by lakes and known as Te Schimmer Eiland. But then a guy came along and said, this area is ripe for some polders. That guy was Jan Adriaanszoon Leegwater. He drained the lakes, creating the Beemster and Schimmer polders.
Tell them about Leegwater's name.
Nay, Willem. If you recall, he did that to us in Den Haag. He kept coming over, telling me things to tell you. Dames en heren, Willem van Erich.
Jan Adriaanszoon Leegwater. Quite a fitting name for a guy draining water from land. Why is that, you ask?
Willem, they didn't ask.
But they might have. You would have asked, right? And I would have told you, because leeg means
Empty.
so his name literally means empty water. He wasn't born with that name, though. He was simply Jan Adriaanszoon. And that means Adriaan's son, Jan.
Jan was a builder of windmills, a hydraulic engineer, and he was also an architect. An architect indeed. This prachtig building was designed by Jan in 1630. It's the Stadhuis. This is the classic view of de Rijp. So we'll just linger here and take it all in for a while. Willem, I bet you're going to paint this view, yeah?
Let me see. Ja, zeker. You've got the Stadhuis, you've got the Broek, you've got the canal. It's prachtig. Mooi. Uitstekend. Heerlijk. Aantrekkelijk. Geweldig. Heerlijk.
In the early days, before the polders were created, de De Rijp was a herring and whaling town. The herring fishermen operated on the Zuiderzee, while the whalers were far out in the North Sea. Along with herring and whaling, the processing of hemp was a big industry here. Fishing nets and ropes were made using hemp. The Staatswappen of Enkhuizen is 3 herrings. The Rijper Staatswappen is very similar, with 2 herrings.
De Rijp had the second largest herring fleet, after Enkhuizen. Perhaps that's why Enkhuizen has one more herring on their Staatswappen.
The stadhouse that Leegwater built in 1630 had a dual purpose. It was also the Waag, the weighhouse. That's Jan Boon Jr. Make no bones about it. His family was one of several influential families about town. They made their wealth in the herring and whaling industries. This is the Raadzaal, which was the council chamber. It has all the feel of a Golden Age seafaring village. Check out the interesting legs on the table, which was made over 400 years ago. The cabinet was designed by Leegwater himself. In order to get the contract to build the stadhouse, he had to prove his worth with this cabinet. When the time is ripe for marriage, the stadhouse makes the perfect backdrop.
We're going to wander around these quaint, narrow streets.
On our Den Haag show, we mentioned how the Hall of Holland stems from the word hout. That means wood, and the early Dutch landscape was covered in forest. That meant plenty of wood for ships and houses. Wood houses meant fire was always an accident waiting to happen. The hemp industry meant there were many warehouses filled with easily ignitable hemp.
I'll talk about the fire later, but for right now, there's something I want to point out. You know how in Amsterdam all the houses have a pulley beam sticking out? Willem, show them a photo, alstublieft. Here, the Rijperhuizen all have a finial, and they're all different. That's those pointed thingies at the top of the gable.
This unassuming house once belonged to the famous Dutch writers Dekken and Betje Wolf. I bet you never heard of them. Neither have I. But that could be because they eventually moved away because of the stench of whale oil processing. In 1780, declared,
"We live in a land dripping with whale tear."
Tear, from the Dutch word tran, was the oil obtained from bowhead whales, which were found around Greenland.
The smell was so bad from the cooking of tear that it was said you could smell a whaling vessel coming before you could see it. with the whaling industry long gone, the air around here is fresh and clean and ripe for the taking. A deep breath, that is. 1654 was a tumultuous year for Nederland. That year, there was a huge explosion in Delft, known to history as the Delft Thunderclap. That same year, there was a huge fire in de Rijp. It ate the entire town, leaving only the Stadthouse.
This house dates from the middle of the 1700s. It's called In Touten House, which means in the wooden house. I suppose that means we should be in the wooden house.
The fire that ravaged de Rijp in 1654 was depicted in a painting by Egbert van der Poel and on display in the museum. The first floor of the museum has all the saltiness one would expect from an ancient fishing and whaling village. There's no escaping the sea here. Scattered about are the tools of the Rijper whalers. They are whale bones and fragments of ships. The bowhead whales they hunted are a species of baleen whales. Baleen is a filtering system in lieu of teeth, holding in a mouthful of food while dispelling the seawater. Made of keratin, baleen had various uses, such as corsets and umbrella ribs. In the heyday of whaling, de Rijp had numerous processing plants for Walvisstron, whale tear oil. The museum shows how the whole village was connected to fishing and whaling in some way: rope makers, carpenters, and shipbuilders. This is an Inuit kayak given to Jan Boon Jr. by Rijper whalers. Remember that guy with the empty water last name? No way could this museum leave out hometown boy Jan Adriaanszoon Leegwater. Earlier, I told you that Leegwater was a builder of windmills. One invention he's known for is the rotating cap on a windmill. This meant the top could be turned to whatever way the wind was blowing.
This guy hanging around the Grote Kerk is Jan Janse de Veltefrey. He was born here in 1595 and was a sailor in the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. After capturing a Chinese junk, he was shipwrecked in the storm and ended up in Korea. No other Dutchman, or European for that matter, had been there before. But because Korea was in the midst of an isolationist period, de Veltefrey was forbidden to leave. He became an advisor to the king, married a Korean woman, and took on the name Pak Jan. What say you, Pak Jan? He says we should go inside the Grote Kerk and check out the stained glass windows, the Rijperglazen.
The fire of 1654 also ate the church. It was rebuilt in 1655, and the stained glass windows this church is famous for were donated by the towns of West Friesland. You can see their stadswapen on the window they donated. This one is the Kaupers Werkplatz. That means the Coopers or Barrel Makers Workshop, which can be seen in the middle section. The section above shows the Maiden of Enkhuizen. Riper ship owners donated this window. Their family shields can be seen on the lower section, while the middle section shows a herring tube. There's no mistaking the Amsterdam Stadswapen. They donated this window in 1655. The top panel shows a cog ship, which were small trading vessels popular amongst the Middle-Age Hanseatic towns of Northern Europe. Known as the god Mars, this window was donated by the councils of West-Friesland and Waterland. The theme is the end of the 80 Years' War in 1648. You can see the Stadswapen of 7 West-Friesland cities and West-Friesland itself. The city of Purmerend donated this window in 1654. This is interesting because the Stadswapen at the center with the boat and pennant comes from Willem Eggert, the first Lord of Purmerend. Later on, the Stadswapen became just the gold barbs on a black background. Monnikendam donated this window in 1655. Monnikendam means monk's dam, and the middle section shows a monk.
The monk is trying to fight off the 2 big cats, yelling, "Damn winged lions!" And that's how Monnikendam got its name.
Nay, Willem, but a splendid interpretation. The 3 herrings on the Stadswapen tells us this window was donated by Enkhuizen. The Stadswapen is flanked by a fisherman and his wife. In the Stadscape, on the lower section, you can see the Dromedaris, which greets you at Enkhuizen's harbor. Alkmaar donated this window in 1657. 1 year earlier, Hoorn donated this window. While you might expect Edam's window would have a round red cheese ball, theirs depicts elements of shipbuilding. Edam was known for shipbuilding. Supposedly as a joke, the artist who made the window in 1655 painted in a dog's head. The city of Medemblik donated this window in 1656. However, it was replaced in a 1904 restoration. Known as draining locks, the Wappen at the center is of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. He created the waterboard, and it was they who donated this window in 1656. For the Low Countries, a land below sea level with water everywhere, the waterboard and the control of water was quite important. This window was donated by Makelaar Venant Toll. A makelaar was a real estate agent or broker. The window donated by Haarlem depicts the siege of Damietta on the coast of Egypt. This window was donated by the municipality of Rijp. Those 2 big cats look awfully hungry. Might not be a good idea leaving those 2 herrings sitting there. Maybe that's why Enkhuizen has 3 herrings. They don't have cats guarding their catch. In 1830, it was decreed that people could no longer be buried in the churches. However, in 1847, King Willem II made an exception for Jan Boon, making him the very last person to be buried in a church. Jan also has the distinction of being de Rijp's last ship owner. But wait, there's more, because Jan was also the last of his family line.
So, how is it Jan Boon got the king to grant him an exception? allowing him to be buried in the church.
Jan had inherited the immense wealth built up by his family. He and his two siblings were all childless, so when those two passed, Jan got it all. In his will, he decreed that his fortune would go to help his hometown prosper. He made a deal with the king to allow him to be buried in the Grote Kerk next to his wife in exchange for helping his hometown prosper.
Born into a Mennonite family in 1758, Jan Boon Jr. married Trintje Lackeman, who hailed from Cromony, about 8 miles southwest. Jan had both herring tubes and whaling ships, and even bought a new ship a year before he died, at age 88. While de Rijp is a gemakkelijk day trip from Amsterdam,
You remember gemakkelijk from a past word of the day, niet waar? Gemakkelijk. It means easy. So, de Rijp is an easy day trip from... Oh, I'm sorry. Continue?
yeah. So anyway, de Rijp is a gemakkelijk day trip from Amsterdam.
You said that already.
Well, if you stop interrupting me, I'll tell them that you won't be disappointed coming to de Rijp. It's such a charming village, and everyone greets you with Goedemorgen, Goedemiddag, and Goedenavond. And speaking of Avond, go ahead and spend the night and be rewarded with a peaceful twilight.
If you've traveled around Nederland or just Amsterdam, then you've no doubt seen water everywhere. So when you hear the village name, Broek in Waterland, surely you must be thinking, isn't the whole country Waterland?
Just a 14-minute bus ride from Amsterdam is Broek in Waterland, or Broek for short. Just like de Rijp, Broek is surrounded by polders. The land is reclaimed from the sea using what's known as a windmill passage, a gauntlet of windmills working together to pump out water.
Nice views of the lake, niet waar?
The lake and the street next to it are called Havenrock. Rock is an Old Dutch word meaning a straight section of a waterway. So Havenrock is a straight section of the harbor. While now a lake, in the Golden Age, it was a harbor with a link to the Zuiderzee.
The houses of the working class are all painted in primer and in gray. Because of that, Broek is the village of 50 shades of gray. In the 18th and 19th century, wealthy Amsterdammers started building houses here as an escape from the big city. Those houses are painted in pastel colors.
What do you think? Pretty cute bell gable, huh? From 1826, it's the Nieuw Raadhuis, the new town hall. Just a little further up the street, we have the famous house. I suppose you'd like to know why it's called the famous house. It's the Beroemde House. That means the famous house. One reason it's famous is because Neeltje Potter once owned this house. Neeltje was a VOC shareholder and the Far East spices brought back by her 2 ships made her extremely wealthy. Want to see her? She's in the grote kerk.
September 26, 1573, the 80 Years' War is underway and the Spanish are in town. They completely destroyed the church, which had stood here since 1400. The townsfolk started rebuilding it in 1628, right on top of its original foundation.
It's quite common in European churches for the wealthy and the nobility to be buried in the church.
Dames en heren, Neeltje Potter. Neeltje died in 1789. Lawn. It means lane, and this is one charming lane for strolling. Rijp, with its salty past rooted in the whaling and fishing industry, and quaint, tranquil Broek in Waterland, 2 villages that make a great day trip from Amsterdam and a bit off the beaten path. Well, that's all the time we have. I'm Veronica Lewis. Join us again next time on Let's Go Dutch as we explore more of Nederland and beyond. Tot ziens! In 1573, the Spanish War was underway, and I completely forgot.